News, politics, and special guests with a Texas twist. That's the goal of the Luke Macias Show. Our nation and state are at a crossroads, and if you're not informed, you're not equipped to make the change that our community needs. Join the conversation and join the cause for liberty today. Welcome to episode 25 of the Luke Macias Show. Guys, today's conversation is with Mark Jones, who's the top political science professor in the state. I think he's more respected than any other professor here within the higher education institutions. We got a chance to catch up with Mark to get a little bit of his background. If you don't know where he came from and what got him to Texas, then you'll get to hear about that. You'll also get to hear about his take on the current events going on in the Texas legislature and Texas politics at large and the demographic shifts in our state. So it's an interesting conversation. I hope many of you learn things from it. Thank you so much for your continued support of the Luke Macias Show. I did want to quickly talk about one issue, which is the controversy that's going on around CPS right now. If you are following the Pardo case, you know that CPS went and forcibly removed a child from a home, which later on we found out the doctor who they got an affidavit from actually did not even recommend them removing the child, did not even insinuate or imply that there was a threat to that child's life or any type of imminent threat. Just to give you context, there must be imminent threat. That's when you go to a judge. You basically say, we think this child is getting beaten. We think they're getting mistreated. We think they're getting abused, and we must remove them from the home right now. This is the extreme of extreme circumstances. And CPS seems to have acted very brashly and irrationally and tyrannically in their efforts. If you have not heard about this case, there's two places I'd recommend you go. There's actually three, but you can go to SenatorBobHall.com. Bob Hall is a state senator from East Texas, and he has been publishing a lot of information on this. You can go follow him on Facebook at Senator Bob Hall. You can also go to the Texan.news. They have several write-ups. Daniel Friend is a reporter there who has taken this case and run with it. And so he has a number of pieces up there that you can read that kind of give you background. Also, the Texas Scorecard has published a number of op-eds, one from the Texas Homeschool Coalition and several from Senator Bob Hall as well. So go to those locations, read up on this case. This is something that all Texans should educate themselves on. It is also a case that I believe will be in the news for the coming week, so please continue to stay tuned regarding the abusive practices of CPS. Without further ado, I want to get right to a quick word from our sponsor and then to the conversation with Mark Jones. Thank you. Guys, our sponsor for today's show is Patriot Academy, patriotacademy.com. You have heard me talk about this organization, but this truly is, for many students, a life-altering event. I cannot tell you how many 16, 17, 18, 20, 25-year-olds that have gone to this leadership program and come out with an entirely new direction for their life. You can go to patriotacademy.com to find out where they do these events, but essentially they take these students and they go through a week of being a legislator. They actually debate in the Texas House of Representatives, in the Delaware House of Representatives, Idaho House of Representatives. It's an incredible experience. I have been involved with them. I believe in what they do. In fact, if you contact them and tell them that you heard about them through the Luke Macias Show, I will contribute toward your fee of actually attending. If you know a student that needs to go, that needs direction for their life, they're going to have an opportunity to learn about worldview, about free market economics, about the values that hold society together, and they're going to have an opportunity to be equipped to be a part of making the change that our community, our state, our nation need. So patriotacademy.com. We're grateful for their willingness to sponsor this podcast, and we also want to encourage each and every one of you to check them out. Please do so today. Guys, today I am joined by somebody who I have respected just for his understanding and insight into the legislative process and campaigns and politics and political science in Texas. I think he's the most well-respected political science professor in Texas regarding these issues, and that's Mark Jones with Rice University. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Luke, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm going to admit to our listeners, Mark and I just had a great, stimulating, probably 6 or 7 minute conversation in which I realized I had not pressed the record button. So there was tremendous insight that so many of y'all could have gotten, and Luke just never pressed record. So we had to restart this whole conversation. Sorry about that, Mark.
Well, second time will be the charm.
That's right. We'll even sharpen our points, So Mark, why don't you take a step back and just tell people a little bit about your kind of journey in political science. Where did you start, and what brought you eventually to Texas?
Well, I started off in politics working with my dad, who was very active in Democratic politics in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We did quite a bit of work with Richard Gephardt, Dick Gephardt, who is a leading Democratic figure, as well as other Democrats. So from age 8, 9, 10, I was out handing out leaflets, doing door hangers, all sorts of things in politics, even helping to do surveys back when the way you did surveys was punch cards. These old punch cards that you would essentially punch numbers in, and then you run them in a computer, and that's how you did your survey analysis. My dad was a pollster, and so I was very active then. Ended up going to Tulane as an undergrad, more focused on Latin American politics, but I maintained my interest in U.S. politics, working, for instance, on the 1988 Gephardt presidential campaign. And then went to the University of Michigan for my PhD, focused on political science in 1989, received my PhD in 1994, and went up to Michigan State, where I was on the faculty for 10 years, and then came down here to Rice in 2004.
In Michigan, were you highly engaged within the political process there like you are more in Texas, or how did that work?
No, not at all. In part because back then I was an assistant professor and then an associate professor. Academe has 3 ranks: assistant, then you get tenure, you're an associate, then a full professor.
Okay.
When you're a junior professor, you tend to have to play the academic game. And playing the academic game means publishing in the mainstream journals and having a very coherent focus for your research agenda. And so people like to see you working on Latin American politics. In political science, there is very little credit given to people who work on state politics in general, let alone the politics of a specific state. So it's perfectly normal in political science for someone like myself to study Argentina, a single country. But to study a single state, say like Michigan or Texas, that's seen as sort of second tier or third tier and doesn't get as much credit. You're not going to get the top tier journal publications. So if you want to succeed in political science, you can't really focus on the politics of one single state. You just aren't going to be all that successful. Now, the advantage I have is that in 2004, I made a decision to leave Michigan State, and a job offer at Vanderbilt and a job offer at Rice, both great institutions. But for me, what really tipped the scales was Houston and Texas versus Nashville and Tennessee, which hands down, Houston's a better city than Nashville, and Texas is far and away a better state than Tennessee. So I came here.
I will tell you that I think for conservatives right now, Tennessee is a little better state than Texas, just as far as their overall policy goes. But I understand in 2004, there might have been a different situation.
I think if I still had to pick a place to live, I still would choose Texas over Tennessee.
There you go.
So I came down here, and from the very start, I really wanted to get much more involved in studying Houston politics and Texas politics. And so one of the first meetings I had here was lunch with Dick Murray over at the University of Houston, who's a great expert on Houston politics and Texas politics, and sort of picked his brain about how he thought the best route to follow in terms of developing that expertise. And so then really I devoted myself to the next 4 to 5 years, focusing on studying Texas politics, reading, writing, doing analysis, but pretty much keeping all of it to myself. Not doing much in the way of public writing. I did one paper, but by and large, I was focused just until I didn't really want to become sort of more a public scholar and a public figure working on Texas politics until I felt I had a really good handle on it. And by about 2010, I felt I was at that place. And that's, one of the great things about Rice is that we get freedom to study the topics we want to study them in the way we want to study them with complete intellectual freedom. That is, I've never had any pressure from the president, the provost, the dean, the director of the Baker Institute, Secretary Baker, about not studying a certain topic, not studying a certain topic in a certain way, having a certain result. There's never been any sort of threat of punishment. That's something that I think is pretty rare in higher education in the United States, and especially in Texas, where I think you'd be hard-pressed to find other institutions, perhaps the University of Texas, Austin, maybe not, where you have that freedom, in part because Rice is both a leading private university in terms of we're a member of the Association of American Universities, the elite research universities in the country, but we're also private in the sense that we don't get any money from the state, really. And so therefore, we aren't as beholden to state politicians as, say, you might be at the University of Texas or Texas A&M.
Interesting. So I know you spent 4 or 5 years kind of researching and understanding things, and then started, talking more from 2010, since you became a little bit more of a public commentator on this, to now 2019, almost a decade. What do you see as the changes that have happened, right? Because you kind of walked in right in the midst of what would be considered kind of the Tea Party movement, and that was when Rick Perry got pretty involved in that and decided he was a big believer in all of those issues, and that rise, and then where we are today. What are some of your big takeaways from the last 9 years?
Well, I think in 2010 we saw the rise of the Tea Party and the success of the Tea Party, both in the Republican primary elections and then the wave, at least in 2010, that swept across the state, where we saw in East Texas pretty much all of the old line Democrats get beaten.
Yep.
And we only saw, like, for instance, the only one who really survived was Alan Ritter, because no Republican had bothered to run against him. And then a few days later, he decided, I'm switching to the Republican Party. So we saw the Republican wave sweep over Texas. And I think if I had to look back on the era, I think one thing that we probably did not do enough of was looking at both the Tea Party wave, but also President Obama's presence in the White House and how intricately linked they were. So I think, once we hit 2018 in particular, we can see that when we looked at the Republican high water mark of, say, 2010 or 2014, when 2014, Greg Abbott, essentially delivered a shellacking to Wendy Davis, beat her by more than 20 points in spite of her spending about $50 million. I think that was a sort of illusory high, in the sense that it was based, at least in part, on President Obama being in the White House. I think Democrats now are probably experiencing an illusory high too, due to President Trump's presence in the White House. That is, President Trump's presence in the White House helped fuel the Democratic wave here in Texas in 2018. And I think in several ways. One, it at least a little bit depressed Republican turnout and demoralized some Republicans from turning out to vote. Not a great deal. That's probably the least important factor. But there were some moderate Republicans who probably voted for Beto as opposed to Ted Cruz because of Donald Trump. But I think the biggest effect of Trump was, one, providing a vehicle that Democrats could use to mobilize Democratic base voters, particularly younger voters, but also some Latinos and others, to get them to turn out to vote. And it also, I think, and this is, I think, even perhaps more critical, it allowed them to recruit really high quality candidates in 2018 for congressional races and state house races. If you looked in 2016 or 2014 or 2012, Democrats were lucky to get whoever would file. It could be some dude, some dudette. They could be crazy. They could be not crazy. Democrats had to take what they could get. This past cycle in 2018, just here where we are right now in Congressional District 7, to run against John Culberson, we had 4 really top-tier, high-quality Democrats. Democrats would have killed for any of those 4 candidates in any Republican-held district other than CD 23 in 2016. And here we had 4 running. And the same was true up in CD 32, a bunch of really high-quality candidates competing to run against Pete Sessions. So Donald Trump's presence, I think, both motivated them to run and gave them a belief that they actually could be victorious. And so I think as long as Donald Trump's in the White House, you still have that sort of essentially now you have Republicans flying into a headwind, whereas previously they'd had an Obama tailwind. Now, that all said, if Donald Trump loses in 2020 and we get President Biden or President Warren or President Harris, I would expect things to shift a little back. And so we wouldn't expect to see Democrats doing nearly as well. And so if you're a Republican, what you're probably trying to do here in Texas is weather the storm in 2020 in terms of maintaining control of the Texas House. Texas Senate is going to be red. There's no way that changes. And obviously the statewide officials can't change as well. But the House conceivably could turn blue if the Republicans have a really bad election. And so I suspect what we're going to see is quite a bit of Republican energy focused on protecting the 8 to 10 most vulnerable Republicans, and then also going on the offensive at the approximately 12 to 15 most vulnerable Democrats. That is, the 12 who flipped seats that were held by Republicans, all of whom in the past session had very liberal voting records, some extremely liberal. And then a few other seats where the Democrat isn't, say, lock solid. Victoria Nieve would be an example of that she's difficult to defeat, but I wouldn't say that it's impossible. Or Marianne Perez here in Houston, that if you ran a really good candidate, you might be able to win. Now, those, it's odds are they're not going to win, but obviously, as you know, as a consultant, you want to run, if you're Republicans, really top candidates across a large number of districts to force the Democrats to spread their money. If really only your goal is at best maybe flip 2 or 3 or 4 of them, but then protect all of yours. And as long as you keep that majority, you're safe for redistricting.
So one of the things you noted in your write-up this last session, well, before we get there, let's first do this. Why don't you explain your rankings? Because every time you come out with these rankings, right, especially there are always a couple chiefs of staff and state legislators that get quite upset about where they are in the different ranking system. And I always find it funny because they're and this is just politicians, right? These are just politicians in general. So this is not directed at one person or another. But, if any conservative group has a ranking system, the criticism to them always is, oh, well, they just pick and choose the things based on how happy they are or not happy they are with one person over another, and they try to target people, which I do not, having worked with a lot of these different conservative groups, I don't believe that's the case, especially with the Fiscal Responsibility Index or Young Conservatives of Texas, right? These people have opinions and they make their opinions known. But the point is that you can always levy that criticism of, oh, well, they get to choose their rating system, right? And so you have a system of taking these votes in. Why don't you explain that? And interestingly enough, there's usually very little discrepancy. When it comes to 3 or 4 different people all rank people from the most conservative to the most liberal, whether you're using an ideological filter or a system like you do, there's a lot of consistency, right? You can see that, the bottom 20 or the bottom 20, the top 20 or the top 20, the most liberal Democrats or the most liberal Democrats. There's very few outliers. There might be some slight changes within the top 10 or the top 20. So all that being said, why don't you explain that system? And then I've got a couple questions along those lines.
Sure. The system is called ideal point analysis.
Okay.
It's a broad family of work that's been done in political science for close to 40, 50 years. A man named Keith Poole, who's recently or is presently at the University of Georgia, and Howard Rosenthal, who's up at Princeton still. They developed it initially, but they weren't they were not reinventing the wheel, but they were drawing on previous work. To put it in simple terms, what it does is it takes every vote that everyone votes on that's above a certain threshold, that is non-lopsided, and that's designed to exclude votes where only one person is on the losing side. It takes every vote and essentially runs a computer simulation that in the end will locate them on as many dimensions as there are in the legislature. Now, in the current legislature in Texas, we only have one dimension. One dimension explains almost all variance in voting.
Okay.
It is possible to have multiple dimensions. Historically in the United States, back in say the 50s, and there was a really strong liberal conservative dimension, but there was also a small north-south dimension that divided Southern Democrats from Northern Democrats on civil rights issues.
Okay.
But here in Texas, you have one issue explains every vote. The amount that's added by adding a second dimension is less than 1% of explanatory, which is pretty much noise.
I don't really understand what you just said, but let's just keep going with it.
Yeah. Well, the idea is that effectively there are multiple potential dimensions out there.
Yes.
But what the analysis can show us is how much a second or third dimension adds to our explanatory power of understanding where legislators are.
Got it.
And the cases in Texas or in the U.S. Congress today, it adds nothing. The one dimension explains pretty much everything.
Understood. So
this method puts everybody on this one dimension, and it's completely neutral. That is, my code's very simple. It's the simple code. It takes in the votes. It puts out the votes. You can replicate it, and you should get pretty much the exact same result I have. That is, I have no say over which votes are included other than following the standard that's used by everyone. And so one of the advantages of it is there's no criticism that you're cherry picking or essentially trying to drive an agenda or picking bills to hurt a particular senator or state representative, because you have no control over those. Nor could I even really tell you, if you showed me one vote, if I vote on this, what effect it will have. Odds are one vote won't have much of an effect, but it's pretty tough to predict exactly the effect of it because everything interacts with everything else.
Yes.
And it'll take, even on very high-end computers, to run this analysis overnight will take 10 to 12 hours for it to actually run on a pretty sophisticated machine. That gives us the results that allows us to place these individuals from most liberal to most conservative. But there are no absolute values, as it's not saying that the most liberal person is necessarily the epitome of liberal and the most conservative person is the epitome of conservative. It's just within this given legislature, this is the most liberal person, this is the most conservative person, and everybody else is in between. Also included in the analysis, and this I use a form of analysis referred to as Bayesian analysis. One advantage it has is it has these things that are called credible intervals, which is like in frequent statistics or confidence intervals, that essentially if the credible intervals overlap, even if one person is more conservative than another, you can't say they're significantly more. That is, it may just be due to chance. And so, it essentially takes in the uncertainty that exists in any statistical analysis. So there are no absolutes. And so I think what that helps doing is you can have a bunch of people really close together, but one is 20 points more conservative than the other. But if their credible intervals overlap, you have to say they're all about the same. That it's just one, you can't say that one is notably more conservative than the other.
Yep, that makes sense. So one of the things you noted in this last session was that the 12 Democrats that took these suburban area seats that had historically been Republican, one might have assumed that they would be voting within the more moderate bloc of the Democrat Party, right? Because they represent suburban, right of center leaning communities that just recently decided to go blue, and we don't even know if that's a permanent thing or a blip on the radar. But instead, they all ended up in the most liberal third, right? Am I saying that right, or the half?
Well, they're the most liberal half of the Democratic Party.
Democrat caucus.
And then there's some of them that are in the most liberal 10. I mean, that are among like Aaron Zwiener, for instance, from Hayes County. So I think that's...
What is your takeaway when it comes to that overall analysis? I think I have probably a different I have a perspective, but I'm just interested in kind of to say what's the academic view of that trend?
Well, I think one thing it shows is that they're being more principled than pragmatic, and more focused on their campaign and ideology than strategic. That would be one thing. That is that they weren't really thinking about how their votes might affect them with general election voters. They were more focused on trying to promote their Democratic agenda. The second part is probably as freshmen, they may not be all that sophisticated in terms of understanding actually how their voting in the legislature may actually influence how people view them overall. And so, there's sometimes some learning. That is, there are some representatives who, after a session, may move towards the center after they realize that, well, this probably wasn't the best strategy because it opens me up to some weaknesses. I think what they also may be relying on is that state rep isn't the most visible position, and that in the end, they may win or lose, not due to their voting record, but due to which Democrat challenges Donald Trump and how well Donald Trump does in Texas, rather than how they voted in the Texas legislature. I would counter that with that's probably the case if you're talking a 4 or 5 point advantage one way or the other. But when you get down to 1 or 2 or 3 points, then it might actually matter if you effectively provided your opponent with ready-to-use ammunition against you that you're not representative of your district. That is, you live in Hayes County, you don't live in Travis County. And if you live in Hayes County, maybe you should be voting a little more towards the center than, say, Gina Hinojosa. Gina Hinojosa, represents the People's Republic of Travis County there in Austin. She votes far left. That's what her constituents expect. Hayes and Blanco County, I'm not so sure.
No, and I think it's interesting to note that I've always said that some of the public servants that I admire the most from a principle perspective are Democrat congressmen that voted in favor of Obamacare, but all lost in that sweeping election of 2010, because it really showed a long-term belief in the principal policy that you say you espouse, right? Because I don't think Democrats are pushing socialized medicine to ruin our country. Some people might disagree with me, but my point is I think they are naive, and I think they have a significant misunderstanding of economics and the consequences and supply and demand and how that works, and an inability to look at the history of how these have been tried before and not worked. But that being said, they actually do believe, as naive as it is to me, that enacting this policy will help these people, right? So they fundamentally do not actually not want people to have health care. They think I'm going to provide more people health care. And I took a worldview class in high school, and the introduction of it would always, the guy would come on and he'd say, do you really believe that what you believe is really real? And if you really believe that what you believe is really real, then how then should you act, right? And so to me, those Democrat congressmen who knew, voting for Obamacare, right? Public polling was being done. You probably were looking at things very similar. This was not popular in a lot of congressional districts represented by Democrats who voted in favor of the policy because they needed to in order for it to pass. And they knew that might have significant electoral consequences on them, and they still did. And some of the Democrats here in the legislature may have been doing a lot of those same things. You also made a good point that I think is, I'm probably more on the side of saying, that I think legislators think that their voters pay a lot more attention to their votes than they do, right? I'm just overall, right? You'll sit there and talk to some suburban legislator and about some policy that's going on, and they'll go, well, I'm not sure how suburban women are going to look at this. And I'm going, I think when they go in to cast their ballots in November of 2020, I don't know that they're going to be thinking about how you voted on this education policy.
I don't think on specific policies. That it would have to be a pretty remarkable policy for it to really sway people. I think where you're at risk is just putting yourself in a category of being so far on the liberal end of the spectrum that the people may get a little uncomfortable, and that provides pretty ready-made ammunition for your opponents to use by saying they're out of touch with Hayes County or with Western Harris County or with Collin County.
And to your point, people like the Ron Simmons district or the Michael Schofield district or the, formerly Jason Isaac district are probably good examples of areas that voted in favor of Greg Abbott. And these people definitely do not consider themselves significantly further left on the political spectrum. And so putting yourself in there does make you somewhat vulnerable when it comes to the broader narrative.
Right. There's some of the Dallas County Democrats are probably pretty safe, and the Dallas County is trending increasingly blue, and doesn't really matter that they're not going to get themselves booted out of office because they've been on the liberal end. But some of the suburban areas, suburban Houston, Harris County, Collin County, Hayes County, maybe parts of Williamson County, there you might have some trouble. But it all depends on, do the Republicans draft a credible, talented candidate, and can that candidate campaign in an effective way? The
argument I'd make in favor of, or just to make the point of how uneducated some voters are when it comes to down the ballot, right? I use Linda Coop and Matt Rinaldi as an example, right? They're right next door to each other in Dallas County, and they both had very far left Democrats running against them that had very radical views that did not align with kind of the suburban middle class, upper middle class areas that they have. But they also were very different legislators, right? On every spectrum. Linda Coop was a older woman.
And more of a centrist.
Matt Rinaldi was considered the most conservative Republican in the legislature. Linda Coop was backed by parent PAC and teacher unions. Matt Rinaldi was a vocal supporter of public education reform and school choice. Matt Rinaldi was very pro-life. Linda Coop had taken votes in favor of abortion. These are people that are very different when it comes to their ideological spectrums. Both very pleasant people to be around, but voters threw both of those people out of office, right? It wasn't like you saw these suburban voters going in to vote and going, well, we're not sure we're there. And this other person in the middle, we're all going to support her significantly.
Well, no, and particularly that was the case with the wave election that we had. Candidate quality, at least theoretically, based on what we know about from political science and voting, should become a little more relevant now that straight ticket voting will no longer be an option for people. And people will have to actually physically go down the ballot and vote race by race by race by race. That doesn't mean that partisan voting is going to disappear. It's just that the level of partisan voting has to drop a little bit just by the very fact that people have to go down there. So candidate quality and individual campaigns should matter at least a little more. That doesn't mean that they're going to be the deciding difference, but we can say, just based on this institutional change, that individual campaigns will matter more in 2020 than they did in 2018.
I think that's a phenomenal point. When it comes to that, there are a lot of disagreements on whether the loss of straight ticket voting will significantly help or hurt Republicans or Democrats. Do you have a stronger opinion on that in general?
I think you really have to think about sort of which Republicans you're talking about and which Democrats you're talking about. So, there's sort of one way to think about it is that in jurisdictions, that could be legislative districts, it could be counties like Harris County that are trending purple to blue.
Yep.
It benefits Republicans that if you kept straight ticket voting, it pretty much locked in that Democrats would win the seats.
Yep.
By getting rid of straight ticket voting, you at least increase the probability a Republican could win a county-wide position in Harris County or Bexar County or Dallas County, which in the presence of straight ticket voting, you probably couldn't win.
That makes sense.
If you're a statewide Republican, though, you probably do reduce statewide chances of victory because up until now, it's been pretty futile for Democrats to run statewide, Beto being somewhat of an exception, but even he's the exception that proves the rule. He still lost.
Yep.
And all of the his fellow Democrats lost as well, and Republicans have won every election statewide since 1996.
Yep.
So that's an area where it increases the likelihood that you have separation among the candidates, and that if the Democrats nominate a strong candidate against a weak member of the Republican herd, that candidate would have a greater chance of victory.
So during this last campaign, it would have been examples like Ted Cruz or Ken Paxton.
Or Sid Miller.
Yeah, Sid Miller was the other one, right? So those three who are the lower performing individuals. The question is, how much did straight ticket voting help push them over the edge?
Right, and particularly not with Cruz, but with Paxton and with Miller, they more likely than not would have had a more credible Democratic challenger had that person known that they weren't competing against Greg Abbott in the entire Republican straight ticket. So that's I think where Republicans are risking something is that they may start to lose some of those, and then in some of the redder counties, they may also start to lose some county level positions just as straight ticket voting advantages Democrats in blue counties, it advantages Republicans in red counties. Now, one final factor that I suspect could be part of the lieutenant governor's calculation. Let's be clear. The reason we got rid of straight ticket voting is because Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick decided he wanted to get rid of straight ticket voting. Strauss had always been in favor of getting rid of straight ticket voting. But it was Patrick who in 2017 decided we're going to get rid of it. Had Patrick said no, we still would have it. So I think probably what also might be part of the calculation is a belief among some Republicans, and this is something that will remain to be proven, that there's a belief that you're going to have greater Democratic roll-off than you are going to have Republican roll-off. And that is that a greater proportion of Republican voters will make it all the way down the ballot, particularly in the big counties. In the smaller counties, it doesn't. I mean, you don't get ballot fatigue because you only have 10 or 15, 20 spots on the ballot. But in Harris County, where you can have as many as 90, 95, Dallas County, 70, 75, I think there's a belief that as you get further down the ballot, Democrats are going to give up a little more early than Republicans, and therefore that you will get Republican advantages as you go down there. Now, that's a theory. We'll have to see if it actually occurs in practice.
It's interesting, and I guess one of my fears is I think that some Republicans might underestimate how many voters there are out there that are planning on going in and voting for Trump and could kind of care less about the rest of the Republicans down the rest of the ticket, right? I mean, that's just a reality. A lot of those are clients of mine, right, that are down the ticket. So we want to fight for that. But I don't know that, I'm not sure that Republicans are feeling super loyal to every single Republican as much as Democrats are feeling super loyal to every single Democrat.
You run the risk. You run the risk. I mean, you definitely run the risk. I think a lot of Republicans run the risk that whereas previously people would have gone in and voted straight ticket Republican and there and voted for Trump, now they may go vote for Donald Trump and then maybe they'll vote for John Cornyn, and then they get to the Congress, and they're like, okay. And then they get the railroad commissioner, like, I don't even know what a railroad commissioner is. And then they leave. And so at most, maybe they vote in the Senate and U.S. House race.
It's going to be really interesting to do the hindsight 2020 perspective on analyzing those election results.
I'm not entirely sure what sort of metrics went into the 2017 decision. I think probably only really Lieutenant Governor Patrick knows.
I do. And I think Harris County probably had a big thing to do with that. So, when it comes to the analysis you've done on the Texas legislature, the legislative side, not the campaign side, but the legislative side, I know you have told me before, too, that you've gone back and started to look at sessions for quite a while. Why don't you tell our listeners just about a little bit of that and the research that you've done and when some of that might be available for the public viewing?
Well, I have a project. It's called the Texas Legislative History Project, which has gathered or is in the process of gathering roll call votes for every session in the Texas lower house and Senate from 1836 to the present. So from the days of the Texas Republic, when they were having the sessions up in Washington on the Brazos, to this past May up in Austin, when they were having them. We have the roll call votes for the House, and I've collected about 85-90% of them. This summer, my hope is that by August, I'll have finished up the House completely and have the Senate going back. The Senate's already, I have going back to 1945, and then I'm going to start going back on the Senate. But my goal is by the end of the summer to have the entire House done, and then we'll start being able to do analysis of different patterns of legislative voting, key issues in Texas. So I've done some work already on the days of the Texas Republic, and one of the things that's interesting there is that you have some sessions where there are multiple dimensions, and then there are others where there are relatively limited numbers. There's one, for instance, Sam Houston was a major factor in that he was the principal dividing dimension during his tenure as governor, as well as even when he was out of governor and Lamar was governor. But then there was also a Western versus Eastern split, primarily related to Comanches and sort of funding for military outposts. So I still have to get into it, but I've done the analysis and I've started to look at the data, but it's a pretty fascinating way to look at Texas. And so the final goal of the entire project is effectively using roll call votes as a lens to observe Texas history from 1836 to the present, and how Texas has evolved politically in terms of cleavages, dimensions, partisanship, and representation during that entire period.
One of the other things I know you've spent some time studying is the effect of international policies in South American countries and things on migration. Why don't you tell me have you published some of that work, and what are some of your findings out there?
Well, I've done some work primarily for the Inter-American Development Bank and the U.S. government, focusing on Guatemala, El Salvador, and to a lesser extent Honduras, where the focus has been on trying to understand how the political institutions there are structured and how you can reform or modify those institutions to have more effective and efficient public policy. So if you look at immigration today in the United States, the immigration crisis, or the large number of migrants coming from Latin America, are primarily coming from Central America. Migration from Mexico is pretty much net zero. That is, we have about as many people leaving, going back to Mexico, as coming from Mexico. The big push are people from El Salvador, Honduras, and to a little lesser extent Guatemala. And they're primarily fleeing the conditions there, which are dreadful. These have always been poor countries, but over about the past 15 to 20 years, you've had drug gangs, the Maras, MS-13, Barrio 18, and their sort of iterations that have made life pretty much impossible in both of the countries. So if you aren't wealthy in Honduras or El Salvador, odds are you live in a neighborhood where the gangs effectively control things. You can't rely on the police or the government to protect you. And it can be very dangerous, especially if you have children, young daughters. If you have boys, they're going to want to draw them in to work for the gangs and be part of the gangs. If you have girls, to work for the gangs or for trafficking, exploitation, or to be the unwilling girlfriend of a gang member. And so that causes many people to flee to the United States, even though they know they're going to have to traverse very dangerous terrain in Guatemala and then Mexico. They know when they get to the United States that they're going to have to cross the border. They're going to face detention. Migrants are rational actors. They weigh the pros and the cons, and the benefits, in spite of that journey across Mexico, the perilous journey there, and being detained in the United States, the benefits outweigh the costs, especially when you compare it to what they have in El Salvador or Honduras, which is very little.
Do you think that when you look at the immigration debate and discussion across our nation, where do you see it shifting? So what I mean by that is, I feel like 10 years ago, the dividing line was not a group of people that fundamentally believed that we as Americans should make a decision to decide who comes in and out of our country, and who does not think that we as Americans have that right. Yeah. So, but I sense that is more the dividing line when it comes to immigration than not. And of course, Democrats don't want to take that position, but I just have yet to see recently any Democrat talk about us making a decision on who crosses and who doesn't, right? Because, so how do you see the immigration debate changing within our nation?
Well, it's become a very polarizing issue, and that's unfortunate because it's driven a wedge even further between the two sides and essentially drowned the hopes of reaching some type of comprehensive reform, which, like any reform, requires compromise.
Yep.
So it's as Secretary Baker says, compromise is not a dirty word. Capitulation is. Compromise is not. And so the difficulty is, I think, on neither side do you have Republicans willing to sacrifice enough or Democrats willing to sacrifice enough. And as a result, we have the status quo, which is a broken immigration system. And I think on all sides have some good points. That is, on one hand, the United States can't accept everyone. That is, you can't essentially have an open door policy for everyone fleeing impoverished countries throughout the world simply because we don't have enough resources to be able to handle that. On the other hand, we do have people inside the United States, approximately 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants. Some of them are DACA, sort of childhood arrivals. Some of them have temporary protected status, a smaller number. All of them are in some type of legal limbo. And the reality is many of them are functioning members of our society. And so some type of plan needs to be developed to effectively bring them out of the shadows and allow them to be functioning members. Where the question comes in is, does that involve citizenship? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. And if it does involve citizenship, how long a period should be required? And at some point, I think some Republicans are unrealistic. The idea of deporting everyone isn't realistic. It's not going to happen. You'd be deporting parents of American children, spouses, people who are vital to the economy, especially places like Texas. On the other hand, the Democratic option of giving everybody citizenship tomorrow and having open borders along with that isn't a viable option either. And so it's really difficult. I remember Ted Kennedy, back when they almost came to essentially an agreement. Mm-hmm. I can't remember when that back was. It was when Kennedy was involved. He made the point of, if we don't if we don't approve this reform, things are only going to get worse. And he was right. It's a very difficult issue, but it's one that we just aren't addressing. And if anything, the sides are becoming further apart. I think the Democrats in some ways have lost some opportunities during the Trump administration because I think President Trump's somewhat of a pragmatist on this issue. Mm-hmm. And I think since he really wanted the wall, he would have been willing to give in, especially on DACA and the TPS, which are two. I mean, if you're thinking of the two groups that probably there's most agreement among Americans that they deserve citizenship or at least a pathway, it's DACA children who came here and have essentially lived their whole lives here, and TPS recipients who've been working and living in the country, and by definition, to maintain their TPS status, have been model citizens, that they should be given some, if not citizenship, some sort of long pathway to citizenship. Although most would be happy for just some type of permanent resident status. That Democrats could have negotiated that and gotten the wall, and by their intransigence, they lost that opportunity. Part of it's probably due to the fact that they didn't want to cut a deal with Trump. Maybe they didn't trust him. And the other part is that it benefits Democrats to keep this issue alive because it's a losing issue for Republicans. The border security isn't a losing position for Republicans, but few Republicans are as adept as Rick Perry in walking that tightrope between being supportive of a strong border security and being somewhat hawkish on immigration without being seen as being anti-immigrant or anti-Latino. Mm. Rick Perry did a very good job throughout his administration of walking that line where he was seen as a strong advocate of border security, but no one ever accused him of being anti-immigrant or anti-Latino, or at least no one credible did. The difficulty is most Republicans are not that adept. And so many that try to walk that line fall into statements or rhetoric or policies that are viewed by many Latinos as anti-Latino and anti-immigrant. And much of President Trump's policies have fallen into that camp as well. So, for instance, the cancellation of TPS, while it's a small number of people, you're adversely affecting hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans and Salvadorans and Hondurans who have American children, American spouses, friends, and families. So the multiplier effect of people who have a negative view of President Trump because of that is larger. Now, I wouldn't want to go to the Democratic edge of the spectrum and saying that Donald Trump is therefore unpopular among all Latinos. Data show he is not. That is, his floor among Latinos is somewhere around 30-35%. Mm-hmm. But at the margins, it does hurt Republicans in some districts.
Do you think that the absence of handling this issue from a legislative perspective is also fueling the tensions. What I mean by that is, DACA was not passed through Congress, right? So basically you take action on an issue not based on changing policy the way compromise is required through the legislative process. Compromise is not required because if you're getting what you want by people crossing the border and not getting caught. I mean, we have, so my point being, you have people crossing the border who are currently not being apprehended. We already know that. Law enforcement says, hey, we're getting 100,000 people, but for every 100,000 we get, there's another 100,000, 150,000 that are coming by that we're never catching, and they're just in our country. Yeah. The reality of the fact that if we're not enforcing the laws as they exist, does that also remove the need to find a compromising policy that takes in different sides into consideration, right? Well, if you're allowed to just pass your executive order, give people citizenship, which another president can then just take away. And then if your position is, we're not going to enforce the laws that are on the books, meaning these people are coming in illegally, that is illegal. Now we can debate that. Yeah. If you think it should be legal for those people to cross, let's pass a law that says that. Well, we don't have the votes in the Senate. Well, that's maybe why that rule exists. So that's why compromise has to be found. And now but when these issue continues to be allowed to persist, absence a requirement to even come to the table, does that also make it very difficult from a policy perspective?
I think it does, in terms of essentially the ability of presidents to do something by executive order or decree allows sort of is like a pressure. It's like a pressure valve. It's like an escape valve that releases some of the pressure. So the pressure on President Obama to negotiate related to immigration was reduced when he could do DACA on his own. The pressure of Donald Trump and Republicans to negotiate is released when they can enforce immigration law a little stronger. They can eliminate TPS. They can change rules regarding asylum and detention. So I think, that is the extent to which the executives have these sort of ad hoc ways that they can at least release some of the pressure, that reduces pressure on Congress to actually come to an agreement. Because in the end, during the Obama era, Democrats said, well, things aren't that bad with DACA, and maybe we'll get DAPA through, and we have TPS that we can extend forever. Then they lose, and Republicans might have been more willing to negotiate, but now Republicans are like, well, we're not going to negotiate if you're not going to come to the table, because we can do some of these things on our own.
Yep.
So it's a very difficult issue, and the sad part is, you have millions of lives that are adversely affected, but at the same time, you can't take everybody. That's one thing that is realistic. If the United States can't absorb that many people, and then also the United States, has to look at immigration from a humanitarian perspective, but also from a strategic perspective. That is, you also should be looking at immigration in terms of improving the United States. So who can add the most to our brain power? So are you bringing in doctors, scientists? So you have companies right now that can't get enough visas for computer science engineers, for software engineers, for people working on nanoparticles, because there's a limit. Those are the people that you need for the country to grow. So you have to find a balance between, and that's where Democrats, for instance, have been unwilling to negotiate ending chain migration, which essentially allows people from very extended families to sponsor people, which, is sort of some family member got here for whatever reason, and therefore they have an advantage over somebody who might be able to bring much more to the table in terms of medicine or science or elsewhere. So I think finding a proper balance, but that requires negotiation. And when I look at Washington today, there's nothing that leads me to believe that we're going to have the conditions for that type of negotiation anytime in the near future.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. When it comes to this legislative session, how much do you think the 2018 elections affected the issues that were discussed, debated, and the issues that weren't discussed and debated?
Well, I think the 2018 election results, Beto O'Rourke's success, but also the Republican loss of 12 Texas House seats, 2 Texas Senate seats, and 2 U.S. House seats, that was an alarm bell that I think most Republicans heard. And the belief was that we probably went too far in 2017. We damaged our brand. And while we can't control everything, we can't control Donald Trump in the White House, we can't control who the Democratic nominee is, to the extent to which we can control things on the ground, we can control the image of the Republican Party by what type of 2019 legislative session we have. And so the focus was away from issues that were more priority for the Republican base and more focus on issues that are priority for general election voters. So with particular, the issue of property tax relief and public education. I think, especially Republicans saw that one of the reasons, or at least the belief is one of the reasons why they lost in Williamson County and Hayes County and Collin County and parts of Harris County, seats that used to be Republican, was dissatisfaction by parents with the public education system, people who in the past had voted Republican. So that was, I think, one thing. Yep. Also, I think Governor Patrick...
and let me come in here, and then I'll let you go on, Patrick. I mean, the interesting thing is that most parents who are moving into those suburb areas are moving there because of the public school system, right? So I think that's also an interesting, just from an electoral perspective. Right? I'm not talking about the policy. I'm talking about electoral politics here. We talk a lot about education situations, and you go, actually, the people who are moving there for the school system. So I mean, they're not saying with the purchase of their home and saying I'm coming here because of the school system, necessarily saying this school finance system is broken. I think that a lot of those people do hate Robinhood because it ends up jacking up their property taxes and they're paying those statewide.
And it's effectively, I don't think they knew exactly why they were upset with the public education system, but they moved from Travis County to Leander, from Travis ISD to Leander ISD. And they said that's because Leander ISD is great. And they get there and Leander ISD has some problems. They're like, what's going on here? This is why I moved. This is why I drive 40 minutes a day or whatever. And they blame the Republican Party. And so I think one of the real benefits that the Republicans can come out of this session with is being able to say, we heard you, that you said there was a problem with public education. We passed this very substantial reform and provided enhanced funding for public education, as well as are going to improve how it functions. And in addition to that, one of the things you're also complaining about is your property taxes, and we're going to provide property tax relief. So the message and sort of that you get from Austin this session are Republicans working on providing more finance for public education and providing property tax relief, as opposed to you go back to 2017, and that was overshadowed by a bathroom bill. And so I think for many general election voters, that was a positive thing. I think we also saw a different Lieutenant Governor Patrick this session. 2017, Dan Patrick ran the Senate with an iron hand. Pretty much everyone fell in line, and to the extent to which Kel Seliger, didn't say yes, sir, one or two times, he had a primary challenge. Craig Estes was very loyal during 2017, but the original sin of 2015 was never forgiven, so he had a primary challenge. All of the rest of the senators tended to follow Patrick's lead and didn't, only sort of, rebelled against him on very isolated incidents. Fast forward to 2019, we saw Dan Patrick only win by 5% against no-name Mike Collier. So he didn't do very well electorally, whereas Greg Abbott was up in the low double digits, and Glenn Hager and George P. Bush, who also faced sort of unknown rivals, had double the votes of Dan Patrick. So that was, I think, a rebuke by there are at least some voters out there. They could be 5% of the electorate, that voted for Greg Abbott, didn't vote for Dan Patrick. Voted for Glenn Hager, didn't vote for Dan Patrick. The other thing was Patrick lost two of his senators. He lost Connie Burton and he lost Don Huffines. That doesn't look good. And had it not been for the Bexar County Democratic Party's either incompetence or selfishness, he would have been down to 18 senators without Pete Flores. So I think that also hit Patrick in the sense that the senators were less willing this session to essentially follow Patrick's lead. The other difficulty Patrick had was it was very easy to work against Joe Straus because in the end, Joe Straus could never, recover in the eyes of many Republicans from the original sin of 2009 when he and 10 other colleagues, the Gang of 11, the Polo Road Gang, joined with Democrats to oust Tom Craddick, the Republican Speaker. And then, at least for his first few sessions, essentially gave Democrats veto power of a lot of different legislation. So it was... Patrick knew that, Greg Abbott always had to be at least could never get too close to Straus because that would essentially undermine him in the eyes of many Republican activists. The one thing that the election did in 2018 was it scared a lot of Republican legislators. A lot of members of the Texas House, people like Jonathan Stickland, Bill Zedler, who are more conservative, but they won by less than 5% of the vote. So there are a lot of Republican legislators who also wanted somebody in office who was going to sort of look out for the legislature and essentially push through parties that would help the Republican brand, not hurt it. And Bonin came in as sort of, and he very, I think, astutely, he stayed out of the race, saying, "No, I don't want to do it. No, I never want the job. I love things here down in Angleton. I don't want to go to Austin too much, other than as a regular rank and file member." But then he came out as sort of the savior. That is, none of the others had the support he had, and he was able to be elected speaker with universal, unanimous consent among the Republicans. And so he came in a much stronger position and was therefore willing to essentially assert himself with that more pragmatic mission. And that also, I think, helped mellow Dan Patrick out a little bit on policy, and then also was much more in line with what Greg Abbott would have, I think, liked in 2017. I'm of the view that Greg Abbott got pulled to the right by Dan Patrick in 2017 more than he was probably comfortable with. And in 2019, that wasn't the case. You had Dennis Bonin working very effectively. So I think Dennis Bonin was probably one of the biggest factors that explains the shift in the 2019 session. That and Beto O'Rourke, who helped put the fear of God into the rest of the Texas Republican Party.
Do you think that Republicans are in any way in danger of deflating their Republican energy as a result of the session? And so, if you're a typical red-blooded, gun-toting, church-attending Republican, and every time you turn your phone on, you're seeing a neighboring state pass some strong pro-life law, or a neighboring state pass a strong Second Amendment law, or some other issue that you are really motivated by, and then you turn around and Texas has not done any of those things. Does that make you less likely as a Republican to vote Republican all the way down the ballot if these people aren't actually delivering the policy results that you thought Texas would naturally deliver?
I think there are some people who may think that way, but I think you have to balance that against people you lose by pushing policies that are unpopular and help Democrats. So abortion's a really good example. So the Born Alive bill was perfect legislation this session, because that effectively says, if a baby is born, you can't murder it. In some ways it's symbolic, but it also puts Democrats in the corner, because the ardent pro-choice advocates are going to still be against that because they don't like the symbolism of it. Yep. But that's an issue upon which you're in the majority in Texas. Yep. Now, if you start moving to heartbeat bills, that's where you start getting into grayer areas with the electorate. Now, that doesn't mean that it hurts you, but it may, depending on how far you push, you may start to lose votes. And in the end, that legislation isn't going to be held, at least under the current court, is not going to be held to be constitutional anyway. And even if it were to pass, there's other pieces of legislation in the line before it. So I think that was a smart decision by Texas Republicans not to push symbolic legislation that from a policy perspective would not be implemented anytime soon. And if in the event the Supreme Court does decide and say supports a heartbeat bill, then that will be at the next session. They can pass the legislation that session.
I think the real question that's up there is when it comes to these liberal Democrats, right, who get elected and are then within the liberal section of their party because they're truthfully trying to push the policy that they've told everybody they believed in. Right. From the beginning, whether or not that does a better job motivating the people that come out and actually loyally vote all the way down the ballot or not, right? And so how much are we deciding between the people that make their voting decisions within those last couple of weeks, and how much are we deterring our base that we're always trying to get out and vote, right? Well,
that's the constant balance, and you have to, I think that's going to differ by state, by issue, by district. But it's always a balance. That one part of campaigns, as you know better than I do, is getting your base out to vote, and the other is convincing people to vote for you. And it's usually a combination of the two.
Well,
and also, I guess another point is, and this is, I think, something we saw this past election, not giving the other side something to mobilize around to turn out to vote against you. And I think that's one of the things with Donald Trump was Trump provided Democrats with something to turn out to vote against.
Yep.
That is, and the sort of the genius of Beto was also giving them something positive to vote for.
Yes.
And so
It was a push and a pull.
Yeah, so you had this perfect storm in Texas where you had one group of Democrats turning out to vote against Donald Trump,
Yep.
and another turning out to vote positively for Beto and his change.
Yep.
Now, the problem for Beto, I believe, is now that he's running for president,
Yep.
that post-partisan, I can be everything to everyone,
Yep.
Beto no longer exists.
Yep.
That is, the Beto that is right now running for president is a pretty strong progressive who's renouncing all of the centrist positions that he took in the past on essentially support for law enforcement, on support for oil drilling, on means testing for welfare. He's renouncing all of those. And the difficulty he runs into is that his past isn't all that progressive, and he's competing against a bunch of people for that same progressive vote who have very good, crystal clear progressive track records like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
The truth is, I mean, if you were a leftist progressive in Texas and Beto was running against Ted, you were voting for Beto, right? I mean, you weren't going, well, what's your position on fossil fuels?
And the thing was, Beto, but even because the Cruz campaign did not attack him from the left, Beto was able to be everything to every Democrat. So I would talk to some Democrats who thought he was a democratic socialist, or they thought he was a true progressive because Cruz never attacked him from the left. He never said, because I mean, it didn't appeal to him, and also I don't think Cruz ran a very good campaign. And it was in the end they started to ramp it up. But I think one of the biggest errors that the Cruz campaign made was letting Beto be everything to everyone up until at least October or September, so they could have at least, I mean, and you actually saw the Club for Growth of all groups recently when his presidential run hit him for not being on the left.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was the type of ad that Cruz needed to get out there, not from Cruz because it would seem somewhat weird and duplicitous, but to get it out among sort of targeting online, targeting left-wing groups via Facebook to show he isn't really this progressive you think he is. Like I remember giving talks to large numbers of people, very politically active people. I remember one question I had from someone was saying, he's raising all this money. Do you think that he's going to like try to use this like to, for fund his personal expenses in the future? And I'm like, and my response was, well, given that he's the son-in-law of Bill Sanders, who's worth somewhere between $750 million and $1 billion, I don't think he's going to need to worry about, essentially a living. And what was clear from the audience, and this is like 200, 300 people who are very politically savvy, was they had no idea. They had no idea that Beto is a member of the 1% of the 1%.
So, last thing, not super political. So one of my goals and dreams, like long term, is like 10, 15 years from now, I would love to be an adjunct professor. Okay, so I'm confessing this to you and anybody else listening to this conversation. So it's actually one of my kind of like long-term goals. So as a professor, now again, I don't want to go the academia route and get a PhD and do all that stuff. I'll get a master's and teach. But I love teaching. I love instructing. I love, discipling and guiding and doing all sorts of things like that. So what is any advice you'd have from just a teaching perspective from your, involvement and career in that area?
I think with teaching, one of the interesting parts is what I try to do is actually link the academic work with real world politics and policy. I think students find that to be the most interesting when you can link what they're studying with what they're living in the real world. And how it actually matters for their lives and everyone else's lives. And so the more you can link what you're studying to the world, it's I think, more effective in terms of teaching, but also the students get more out of it. Like a good example would be the required Texas politics course that if you're a state school in Texas, you have to take. That's a course that can be very rich if taught the right way. I have a textbook, Texas Politics Today, where we really try to link up sort of the knowledge that you have to know about campaign finance and how the legislature works. And you actually have a chapter, you have an essay in one of our chapters on campaigns, how all that works, but then linking it up to modern day events so that that students can understand, okay, this is how the Texas legislature operates affects my life. This is how who the county judge is and what the impact the county judge has on policy. Those types of things, the more that you can link them to the day-to-day life of people, I think the more rewarding the course is.
Yep. Well, Mark, I really do appreciate your willingness to sit down with me and have this conversation. I'm sorry about our first dry run of 8 minutes, and there were some gold nuggets that you dropped that our listeners will never get to hear. They were from my ears only at this point, but thank you so much for sitting down, talking, having this discussion, and thank you so much for, just giving us the time.
No, I really enjoyed it. Great.
Hey, thank you. God bless.
Thank you guys for sticking through that conversation. I really do appreciate Mark's willingness to come on and have a conversation with us and talk about his take on where everything goes and how everything's going. At the end of the day, guys, one of the things that I think at least came out a little bit in Mark and I's conversation is that I do think there is a legitimate identity crisis that is going on within conservative circles, but also within the Republican Party of Texas. And Republicans have to decide now what their message is going to be and what type of vision they want to lead with, what type of policies they want to implement, how they want to make people's lives better. And I think that even in the discussion with Mark, him giving his take on this last session and why Republicans did what they did is just more evidence of the fact that Republicans aren't really sure. In fact, sometimes there seems to be an approach to just kind of not do anything controversial because at least that might make us more likely to maintain our power. And I think that if we are able to keep this state red in 2020, which we should be able to do, it will be because there are a lot of Texans who do not want Democrats to take over the nation and are going to come out and vote for Donald Trump to be president. Because anybody who's watched the Democrat debates is scared enough to come out and vote for a Republican presidency to keep them from doing that. And because Donald Trump has actually fulfilled many of his campaign promises. And so I think Republicans on the state level have an opportunity to follow that lead and try to implement even more of the promises that we've made to the people of Texas. Thank you so much for engaging in the show, sending us your feedback. If you have not reviewed it yet, please consider doing so on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Subscribe on any of those platforms and continue to give us feedback. We really appreciate all the encouragement that we're getting from so many of our listeners. Thank you so much. Have a great day. God bless. Thank you for listening to the Luke Macias Show. If you value this content and want our message to spread, please consider 3 of the following steps. 1, subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us on and leave us a review. 2, visit lukemacias.com and sign up for our email alerts. And 3, follow Raz and I on Twitter and visit my Facebook page at facebook.com/Luke Macias, Texas. Again, that's facebook.com/Luke Macias, Texas. Thank you so much, and God bless.